And we're live. Good afternoon, Louisville. Welcome to RE Journal's Breaking Through the Disruption webinar series. We got another great group today. If you haven't been logging on, we've been doing 2 webinars a day ever since COVID broke. So whoever's pushing my slides back and forth, thank you. You can go to the next one anytime. I really need to thank our sponsors, and I want to take an extra minute to say this because while we value getting together. That's what we do at RE Journals. We were scheduled to have 104 live events this year, and we had to pivot here to webinars. We couldn't do it without sponsors like this. It's just been a wonderful way to get to see faces again and hear information and bridge the gap before the time when we get together again. So personally, I wanted to thank, I'm going to have to start up on the top there, Cushman and Wakefield, Wayland, CBRE, Louisville Downtown Partnership, PRG, Louisville Paving and Construction, WCRE Louisville, Kentucky CCIM, SIOR, and again, Corfac International. A great group of sponsors, and we couldn't do this without you, so appreciate that. If you're watching online and you're having connection issues, there's a red button at the top of your screen. I'm showing that we have 4 bars of connection on our dedicated server out of 5, so we should be good. So if you see somebody freeze up or can't hear what they're saying, then go to that, push that reconnect button, and that'll solve most of your problems. On your right, there's a chat room. So go into that chat room right now if you're watching this online. Put your name in, company and state. You can start networking with other people. Also, in there is where you're going to be able to ask questions of our panelists. So while you ask questions, I'll mark it with a red Q, and I'll try to make sure your questions get addressed. We'll save time at the end as well. I'll put up a poll also. You'll see the poll will kind of take over that chat screen. Your chat didn't go away. Just fill in the poll and go back to the chat. We are recording this and all of our other webinars. So if you want to catch the replay of this or the replay of any other webinar, rejournals.com/video replay. We have our own YouTube channel. If you would, and you go to YouTube, it'd be great if you would subscribe, because I have a bet with my kids that I can get up to 500 subscribers. They didn't think I'd get over 100, so we're doing good. Well, there we go. So we're ready to rock and roll. I'm going to start and let these guys introduce themselves. I'm getting a bit of feedback. I'll try to solve that while we're talking. But Bill, we're going to start with you. So tell us what you do. And probably the best way to start is tell us what's going on today, week 8 of COVID-19. What are you doing in your business in response, and how's it been affected?
So I'm an architect, planner, real estate broker for the last 40 years. But for the last 25, I've been in urban real estate development. And we create mixed-use districts anchored by historic properties, and then we create infill projects in between. We have a mixture of properties ranging from hotels to restaurants that we lease to office buildings, to hospitality events places. So we have the entire mirror. So we're putting up fires in some of those areas. Obviously, hotels are very difficult right now. Event places are shut down. Our restaurants are just reopening, and my focus today was really on how we help our restaurants reopen in an effective way. We've been working a lot with Rebecca Matheny and some of the city folks on how those restaurants can spread outside in order to take advantage of our good seasons and spread out. I've also been spending some time in the last few days, working with banks, obviously on various projects, but I was in some meetings today with a bank that I'm on their board, Independence Bank here in Louisville, and they have done a great job with the PPP stuff. It's a fascinating process. I think the media has really been very ineffective in telling the true stories of how those funds have been utilized, and so that's that on a broad basis. We're sort of some things are stuck closed and some things are now reopening, and we're trying to do that in the most effective way while protecting people's health.
Thank you. I'm troubleshooting here in the background. We had some feedback loop. I turned your microphone off, so you'll need to turn it back on again. And the last person I turned off was Steve, so it might be you. But Steve, if you could turn your microphone back on and give us an update on what you do and what's going on in your business right now.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Steve Lamont. I'm with CBRE, and I sit in the Indianapolis office and have been active in the Louisville market since 1998. CBRE is, many of you are familiar, is a broad provider of services in the commercial real estate space, really across the whole spectrum. I find myself on the multifamily side, transacting in the multifamily space, and a lifer. Been sitting in my seat almost, actually a little over 26 years. What's happening in the multifamily space? We'll dive more into that, of course, as the talk goes on. But I'll just set it up with a summary comment that those of us in the multifamily space are certainly grateful to be in that space today, because it has certainly fared better than pick your sector: the hotel space, the retail space, the restaurant space. Even the office space is challenged and might emerge from this still challenged. Multifamily and logistics are the safe harbors, and we are still seeing transaction flow in the apartment space. The bidder volume is down, understandably, but the fundamentals in markets like Louisville, Kentucky, and many others in the central Midwest secondary, tertiary market space are still holding on to their own. Collections data was not the train wreck that we all expected it would be in either April or May. We'll talk more about that as we get through the webinar. But things are different for sure in every aspect of the space, but are still moving forward.
Okay, off to you, Rebecca. Can you hear me? Punch your microphone. Looks like your microphone might be off. This is great. I don't think I've had this much technical issues since our first webinar. Reid, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, why don't you go next, Reid? And
Okay,
Rebecca,
good.
we're going to get your microphone on again. There it is.
Hey, I'm Reid Weinberg. I'm with PRG Commercial Property Advisors. PRG is a locally based company here in Louisville. We're a full service commercial real estate firm. We specialize in all asset classes. We're doing retail, office, multifamily, industrial. We work on development sites. We have a good specialty also in infill related product, and I think that's something that we're keeping an eye on as well. It's been interesting. Things have really evolved, for me at least, in business over the past month or so. It seems like when this thing really first hit in the first week or so, it was like everybody was just in kind of triage mode. We were working on just looking at the existing deals that we had in the pipeline and trying to get those things closed. And that was a challenge, and I look forward to talking about some of those exciting transactions. But over the last couple of weeks, I've really noticed, an uptick in activity. This past week alone, there's just been an influx of inquiries on some of the listings we have, especially the investment properties, like some apartment deals we have. And I kind of attribute that to just maybe things loosening up, people coming out of the woodwork a little bit. The other thing we're really focusing on right now is what PRG really did in the last recession, and that was really one word, and that is to be nimble. I think it's important to kind of shift your focus and look at where the opportunities are going to be. We did that last time. We were entrepreneurial, and we said, well, where's the activity going to be? And we started, frankly, calling all the banks and saying, how can we help you? And we became, between the period of 2008 and 2015 or so, probably the premier company handling bank-related transactions in Louisville. So we were doing selling properties for the community banks mostly. I don't know what's going to happen as it relates to that, but I mean, we're working on our transactions, but keeping one eye on the future and thinking about being nimble and going to where those opportunities are, because things are definitely going to change and be different as we get through the summer. So.
Excellent. apologize for dropping off. I'm trying to figure out how we can get Craig and Rebecca on, but we're going to have to move on without him, and we'll get back to him. So, gentlemen, Bill and Steve, and people right now really want to hear about what happens when we come out of this, but let's just go back in time for about 10 minutes. What happened in your world? Did you have deals blow up? Did you have things surprise you and close? What's the environment been like for the past 8 weeks, and bring us kind of up to date on what's been going on.
Sure.
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay. Well, we were in the middle of a significant hotel transaction that did blow up. I guess it's still got a bit of life in it. We'll see what happens, but it made us really very early on to evaluate everything in our portfolio. We are active in about 5 states with development projects going on, and we really did a deep dive into all of our tenants, how we thought they'd be affected by this, where we thought the weaknesses would be, so that we could start to adapt. Work with the various banking institutions we have, work with our major tenants, make sure they have the concessions that they need to stay in business. Most of our tenants are very long-term tenants, and so they're more like partners than tenants. And we've really tried to restructure ourselves so that we've got the benefit of keeping those long-term relationships in place.
Excellent. Rebecca, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can.
All right, it's your turn. So do a quick intro on yourself, and then what's going on in your world right now, and maybe go back 8 weeks. What's been going on? Well, I'm going to keep you minimized just to keep that bandwidth down.
Executive Director of the Louisville Downtown Partnership. Great. So I'm the Executive Director of the Louisville Downtown Partnership, and we're both a business improvement district and development corporation. So I'm kind of the odd fish out in this group, and in the sense that I don't have any money in this game, except that my job is to support every person on this call who is trying to develop downtown. So we've been trying to keep downtown as clean and safe as possible. But we've also been looking forward as to how we support Class A, how we support housing development, how we support commercial retail. And that's really what we've been focusing on, is how we reopen successfully and how downtowns and dense uses, which we all know are so important, both to our country in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of, how we are going to move forward as communities. So that's what we do. So I'm trying to make sure that we are supporting our financial institutions with the information that they need, to make sure that the financing's in place, to have the development that's in flux go forward.
So before we move on to somebody else, Rebecca, what happened in your world when COVID first started coming on and things had to start being shut down? How did you all react, and what were some of the things you did?
Well, one of the most important things that we did was decide to keep our ambassadors on the street. And we did that in conjunction with our contractor, Block by Block, which is a Louisville-based company, and they're in 105 different downtowns. So we really depended on them for about how they could make sure that clean and safe, and that we could supplement metro services. And so I think that as an organization, one of the things that we know is super important moving forward is how do we we, if we can, depend on our resources to augment what used to be basic services for metros and that are things that metros don't do anymore. Things that developers depend on, permit enforcement, things that developers and finance organizations expect from public institutions that they just aren't going to be able to do anymore.
Right. All right, so let's go on to Steve. So, Steve, what were the first few weeks like of COVID in your market?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll tell you a couple of specific instances of transactions that are perhaps representative of the crisis and maybe perhaps not representative of the crisis. First is a property called Autumn Breeze, 280 unit property that was fully marketed pre-COVID with the typical 25 plus bids in hand. It went to contract pre-COVID, went non-refundable pre-COVID, and it actually closed mid-COVID on time and on price, no retrade, and with no extension of closing timing. So that was perhaps a bit of an exception to and not necessarily reflective of the turbulence that we were about to enter into. And that particular transaction closed on 3/17. Also, not necessarily representative of the crisis was the next transaction, which was also marketed pre-COVID, but was awarded at the very beginning of the COVID crisis and went to contracts mid-COVID, went non-refundable mid-COVID, and will now close also mid-COVID. So those are two case in point and of transactions that my team specifically, which is based in Indianapolis and Louisville, we're a dual market team, has experienced. And then, of course, a platform the size of CBRE, and Craig and Reid could tell similar stories of transactions across the country that have looked very different, where there has been distress, and there has been some retrade activity, repricing activity. But what we're finding is that typically the sellers that are agreeing to the repricing requests are those that have to, and there just wasn't any pre-existing stress in the multifamily space pre-COVID. So we don't have very many sellers with their back against the wall that find themselves in a situation where they have to transact. We are certainly still in a price discovery mode right now, and I say we nationally, the industry. There are, of course, there are two levers we can pull in asset valuation. There's the yield lever and there's the underwriting lever. And we're finding that the capital sources that are on the market today, that are in market trying to place capital, are groups that are not adjusting their yield expectations. They are perhaps adjusting their underwriting expectations. And generally what we're seeing is that there's a flattening out of rent growth in year one with a deferral into year two, where we're seeing maybe 50% of otherwise normal rent growth underwritten in year two, and then playing some catch up in year 3 and 4 as we return to normal levels in year 4 and year 5. So that shift in underwriting approach has perhaps correlated to some rent increase where, some asset value degradation where we would have normally underwritten rent growth in year 1, would have fully underwritten value add strategies with rent bump potential in year 1. We're just seeing that getting pushed down the road a bit. But the other lever, the yield lever, for those that are in the market with capital that need to deploy capital, they can't adjust yields because they do still need to push the capital out the door. And one of the best examples is a group called Pasco based in California, who we actually sold the Autumn Breeze transaction for. And Pasco is raising primarily 1031 capital. Pasco's response through much of this crisis has been, well, of course we're still in the market trying to deploy capital. We're a 1031 shop. We've got capital coming in the door, and therefore we have to continue to push capital out the door. So we're seeing a lot of groups that it just doesn't make sense in a business model where they want to transact to adjust yield expectations upward, even in spite of this crisis that we're in. A couple other stories that I can share. We're on the market with $100 million in a 2-property offering that we rolled out on 311. So just before it got bad, it was a very intentional decision, and remains a very intentional decision to date, to stay on market with those two assets, because again, we know there is capital out there, and the capital, I would say, is primarily two different buckets. It's or through much of the crisis has been two primary buckets: 1031 private capital, which has to deploy, and institutional capital, which is still in the process of fundraising in spite of a crisis. And it just emphasizes the point that for certain sectors, and I'll just emphasize multifamily as certainly one of those sectors, there is still capital that wants to come into the market. We've got 3 or 4 other assets in my team that are on the runway. They are either packaged up or are virtually packaged up. We're just waiting for an all clear to take off. And we, like everybody else, are watching May collections data as a critical indicator as to whether it's time to go to market with new offerings, and also time to call for offers on others that are on market, like the instance that I mentioned just a moment ago.
I got to ask a couple questions, because that's amazing. I think it speaks to the apartment market, and the Louisville market are good. But you talked about money going non-refundable in the middle of COVID. So tell me what those conversations were like. Were they confident that things are going to eventually be okay? I would have felt panicked at that time. So
Yeah.
how did you get the parties to come together?
Right. Well, I think in the one instance, the first instance that I mentioned, it actually went non-refundable pre-COVID, so there wasn't a conversation on refundability mid-COVID in that particular instance. And the second, there absolutely was, and the concern is in that case was over the equity. Is the equity going to be in position to want to commit mid-crisis? And in that second instance, there actually was an extension that was agreed to on the due diligence period, which was purely for the purpose of confirming the equity. The physical due diligence is being completed. All parties, lenders, appraisers, inspectors, and all parties are bending and facilitating to make sure that we can get through due diligence processes in spite of restrictions on access and so forth. So it's really not that piece that was the concern. It was let's just make sure that we have equity in place, and an 18-day extension in this particular instance was enough to facilitate that comfort level.
Wow, 18 days isn't even that bad. That's an encouraging story. I like to hear that. I feel like I don't know what's going to happen next week with this COVID thing. So hats off to those folks for pushing stuff across the finish line. Reid, let's go to you and try to get your face up there on the screen. So tell us the last 8 weeks to present. Any deals blow up? Any good things happen? War stories to tell?
Well, one good thing that happened is I don't have to worry about getting my hair cut. I'm happy about that. I know you all are jealous. But I think, this very much reminded me a little bit of 2008, where when the bottom fell out, whether that was, say, August, September, October of 08, and deals were pending. And we kind of saw those transactions that were pending sale still go through and get to the finish line. There really wasn't a retrading on price all of a sudden because of entering this crisis. I think part of that, to Steve's point earlier, was some of those were 1031 exchange transactions. And I've noticed that that's been a lot of the interest in deals that have gone pending since this hit as well. We've had 2 deals go pending, some mid-sized apartment deals here in Louisville that were 1031 deals. And the way I look at that is a 1031 exchange investor is willing, even though there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of risk, they're still willing to proceed under these circumstances because they would rather take the risk of where things are going to go with this pandemic than pay Uncle Sam the taxes. So if any brokers out there have got a 1031 buyer in their pocket they're working with, I would keep them, because those are the people that are really pursuing transactions. We've noticed that there's a couple deals where, like, for example, it's just amazing. We had a buyer who was in China and stranded there and couldn't come back to the U.S. And the other party was in Denmark and couldn't come back to the U.S. This was an industrial deal here. And they had to go to the embassy to get notarizations on the documents and send them here. And it required a lot of patience. I think that's the number one thing during these deals that sellers especially have to understand. They've got to be a little bit more nimble and a little bit more flexible and grant these buyers opportunities to get done what needs to be done. The banks are slowing down somewhat. One of those transactions was a Freddie Mac was the lender, and things are just moving slower there. And the other thing that's slowing transactions down with like the community and regional banks are the PPP loans. I'm seeing that delays in some stuff because the banks are so overwhelmed with processing those SBA PPP loans that they just need more time to get these transactions done. But I think Steve's right on the price discovery thing. It's still going to take time. We don't know exactly where this is going to shake out. But the most important thing I think everybody should realize is that everybody keeps saying things about we're in a new normal. Where's the new normal going to be? I mean, in my opinion, we were in the new normal, I think, before this hit as it relates to a lot of things with commercial real estate. This is just accelerating it is all it is. And I don't think this is going to, it's just speeding up that process. Retail stores, brick and mortar closing, office users shrinking their footprints, logistics users expanding. So I just think that we need to kind of put it in perspective in that sense. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do is realize that this is just accelerating what was already happening in commercial real estate, in my opinion. So.
I've been doing 2 webinars a week for 7 weeks, or 2 a day for 7 weeks, and I haven't heard anybody say anything that made that much sense, Reid. I appreciate that. There are, when you think about those details, there are a lot of things that were in process that have sort of made their way into normalcy. That's interesting. I'm going to keep that in my pocket. So I think everybody that's on here wants to hear about what happens next. What's the playbook? How do we work our way out of this? And I know people want to hear from Bill because you work with kind of the drivers, right? If people are developing properties, that means times are good. If they're pulling way back, that means we might be in for a long haul. So I don't want to put you on the spot and say what's going to happen next, but Bill, where are we headed? Where are you headed?
Well, I basically look back to 2008 also. There were still things that happened from a development standpoint. They just tended to happen in very niche, sort of opportunistic ways. And I think those things are still going to be out there. I think, the economy in a lot of places, a lot of aspects like the multifamily, we haven't seen any weakening of that at all. And I think there's some opportunity through opportunity zone, through tax credits, the kind of things that we're involved in a lot, to still put some deals together that are very much equity, both real and subsidized equity, that'll allow us to move forward. We're in the process right now of renovating some buildings in Dayton, Ohio, building some new buildings there. That market's being driven by the Wright Pat Air Force Base. The spending in those areas is not slowing down. The innovation that's going on through a lot of tech firms is expanding. And so I think, like Reid said, I think you've got to sit back, and while you're surviving today, you've got to think about where things are going. And there are certain things that are going to speed up. And I think that's where the opportunities are. I think the cities are very oriented towards being involved in helping. And so there are a lot of things that you can get done on a more expedited basis. I've got a lot of conversations with planning and zoning people. Some of the things that, well, there's 2 things going on. Some of the public hearing restrictions are holding things up, but where they can, they're trying to expedite. And we really saw that again in Dayton with some of the things that's happening on there with new, they're utilizing legislation in their community that allows outdoor refreshment areas on a broad basis. that's helping the restaurants come back. Well, it also creates more attraction for people living in the apartments in that area. And so it is really changing a lot very quickly, I think. But I think just got to keep that eye on where the trend lines are going, because I think they've been enhanced.
Well, I got to ask a follow-up question because none of you have mentioned yet jobs. Reports are coming out that April was really bad and that May, and when PPP runs out, June might be Great Depression levels.
I can't hear him.
Does that concern you?
So this is that balance between safe and jobs. And I think if we can open up in a way that allows people to stay safe, I think people are sort of anxious to do that. I think it's going to be a balancing act could be through the whole next year. And I think there's an answer. I think it's a process, and you try to put a cap on it and a bottom, and you sort of move through that as best you can. And I think, again, a lot of effort going in how to think that through. Let restaurants open back up. That's a huge sector. There's some sectors that are going to be left behind. The hotels that we're involved in never closed. They are open, and they are, poised. They were involved with first responders because they're near the hospital district. First responders were staying in those hotels. And while the numbers are far weaker than normal, as people start moving around, we in Louisville, and like much of the Midwest, you get here by car. You're not going to have to get on an airplane. You can move around. I think people are going to start moving around in the next, X weeks, X months. And I think that will help a city like Louisville rebound a little bit more quickly than a lot of them. So I'm optimistic about that. But we have to open up a little bit to get those jobs, people back in their jobs.
To Bill's point, you look at markets that have heavy exposure to arts, entertainment, and recreation, and second quarter employment declines are approaching 50% in that sector. There's bad news all the way through the employment sector until you get down to some areas where Louisville's got some exposure, like finance and insurance and healthcare, where the Q2 employment declines in the finance and insurance sector are about 14-15%. And the healthcare and social assistance sector, we're actually forecasting positive job growth in Q2. So I think the story of recovery is going to be very different market by market depending on the exposure. And when you look at markets like with UPS, I mean, where else do you want to be than have exposure to an employer like that in the e-commerce era that we're in, that's being amplified right now, mid-crisis?
I think that's a great thing about Louisville. I mean, and that was the case in the run-up as
Yeah,
well.
I would add from a downtown perspective, that people who are urban tolerant and so we're anxious to see kind of how they return to restaurants and how they return to work. But people who want to be in cities and around other people are going to have, I think, a much greater hunger to do that than they have been, in the last 6 weeks.
Right. Reid, you were talking, I think. Let's finish those thoughts.
With Louisville? Yeah. I think when I think about Louisville, it's that is what we have going for us. Louisville is the third largest world cargo hub in the United States. We're the seventh largest in the world. Having that manufacturing and industrial backstop, we have Ford here with 2 plants, and I think that's one of the things that makes Louisville such an attractive market from an investment standpoint. I think it obviously helps all asset classes. It helps the multifamily sector as well when it relates to workforce housing. I think the one thing that hopefully a town like Louisville can focus on, though, and this is where like somebody like Rebecca and Bill probably can really attest to, is the downtown market for Louisville is really in the early innings compared to other cities as it relates to development. You know, the past couple of years, we've had some new construction apartment complexes built, but I'll say that we're kind of lagging behind other peer cities in that regard. And hopefully this doesn't knock us back, because I think in order for Louisville really to take itself to the next level, we've got to have a strong, vibrant urban core, and that means people living in that urban core as well. And hopefully, you know, we can keep that momentum going. The other thing is I hope we come out of it really focusing on, you know, the manufacturing industrial base is important, but there's a lot of issues related to some downtown vacancy on the office side and the office towers. And Louisville really needs to work on attracting, you know, maybe some more white collar corporate businesses to town that are going to fill those apartments and fill those office towers. And hopefully coming out of this recession, that's something that we kind of make a focus on as well, because that's really going to get us to maybe catch up with some of the other cities that we've been focusing on, like the Cincinnati's and even the Indianapolises and the Nashvilles of the world.
Hey, Reid, you touched on a subject I want to hear more about because you're in a transportation hub. We've heard people talk about onshoring some manufacturing, but I haven't heard anybody that has talked to somebody that's taken steps towards making that happen. Have you heard anything about that?
Onshoring, you said?
Yeah. Moving manufacturing? No. I think that'll be interesting to see. You know, people don't want to buy things from China anymore, but does that actually translate to people not wanting to really buy things from China anymore? I think that things are inexpensive. I'd rather not pay, you know, a 30% premium. So I'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.
You know, we've got a relationship with a company in Dayton, Ohio. They're our partners in some revitalizing an area, and their business is robotics. And we have had discussions with them. They are seeing that effort to onshore of that process. They're the people who figure out how to, you know, put together a line based on robotic systems that can, you know, address manufacturing processes back in this country. And they've had a lot of work over the last 6 months. It had happened before we got to this, and I think this may just accelerate that, because I think politically people realize how important having these jobs back in the country and these processes back in the country now more than ever. So I think we will see that, but it takes time. I mean, this is not something just flip the switch overnight.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. So they're not worried about, you didn't say anything about the cost, but it's not just a matter of the parts aren't coming in at the pace they were. They have other reasons to onshore.
Well, I think part of it is the security of knowing that your country has the ability to produce that stuff here, so it's not relying like we have done on the protective gear coming in from another country, where we can't really guarantee that it's going to come to us. So,
well, let's pivot again real quick. I have to apologize to everybody that's speaking and online. I don't think we've ever had this kind of technological problems. I know 6 weeks ago I ran around my house with a giant drill bit and put holes in the floor and ceiling so that I could run a wire right into my Wi-Fi hub, so I didn't have to be on Wi-Fi anymore. Because this one of the things we've learned about this new world is your connection to the internet really matters, and kind of getting deals done and getting stuff done. Let's pivot again into what does reopening look like for you? So are you going to go back into the office? Have you never left the office? What are you going to do with your employees? And I think on the apartment side, Steve, what are you seeing some of the apartment buildings do in terms of changing procedures?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think several directions you can take that conversation. As far as what CBRE is doing, we're shut down. We've been shut down. We're now in the 9th week, and Perhaps market by market, we open up beginning in early June and go to some sort of a 50-50 model where half the office works one week, half the office works the next week, and continue alternating like that for some period of time. As far as the apartment space, I think we could expect a lot of different changes, but I think one of the things that we'll see is renters, residents asking themselves, do I want to hop into an elevator with 5 other people? And if the answer to that is no, then we might see some folks say, okay, I think I'm gonna park in a surface lot where I can walk into my building, and that points towards suburban. So there might be a near-term reverb effect that pushes some folks back into suburban mindsets. But I think those are short-lived. I think we've all got to get past this, and we will get past this and do the vaccine at one point, and we'll return to cramming in elevators with each other. But I think that there are a lot of fundamental changes that have taken place right now, and the fact that we're all doing this conference call right now, that many of us on this line and those listening in have been working from home for the last 9 weeks and are realizing, wow, I can actually be maybe not 100% productive, but substantially productive. Not sitting with the people that I used to sit with, not working in a confined office environment before, and we're kind of reinventing the way things are done. So that's gonna play out in ways that we just can't even contemplate right now. But the reality is that unlike other sectors in commercial real estate, people still need a place to live, and multifamily will emerge resilient. This was not so much your question, but I want to mention before we wrap this up that my theory, this is just this is not necessarily a universally accepted theory, but maybe an emerging house view that in the multifamily space post-COVID, we're going to see cap rate compression continue like we saw before. I mean, when this all started 60, 75 days ago, we were still in an environment where yields were compressing without question in the multifamily space and in the logistics space and perhaps other sectors as well. And we're on pause right now mid-crisis, but this is going to reopen, and with the wall of capital continues to get larger, and speaking now historically over the last several quarters, this wall of capital is trying to get placed in U.S. and specifically multifamily. I think that it's very logical that we see the compression model that we just exited pre-COVID resume again, and with great intensity, and perhaps greater intensity as some believe that multifamily and logistics will emerge even more the safe havens that they were pre-COVID.
That's interesting that you say that. Go ahead.
I think the multifamily has always been a very recession-resistant product, and I think that's going to remain to be the case. I think this is a little different this time around because this is affecting the lowest income people in our population more than anybody, and I think that means workforce housing, Class C housing could be affected a little bit more than normal. But you got to think about it, that people are going to want to, if they're going to pay for things, if they're going to cut back on things, the roof over their head is one thing they're not going to cut back on. I think that, but to your point a little bit about how things are changing from a social distancing standpoint and stuff like that, it's changed the way we're doing transactions right now too. I mean, you got to think about property tours and stuff like that. I mean, we've had to get creative with some of that stuff. I think virtual tours is something that was a great product to have before, but that's something that's going to be even more important, not just on residential, but on the commercial space. I think that, we've had to maybe even write into some contracts that buyers don't want to necessarily tour the property right away if they don't have to, and sellers don't want to necessarily let the buyers into the properties right away if they don't have to. So we're writing into contracts things like, the buyer will be permitted to tour 48 hours after contract acceptance and things like that. And the other challenge we're running into is really on the inspection side. We have an inspection of a 65-unit property going on right now today. And, there is the issue that the seller is saying, they're setting ground rules for how many people can go in the unit, what they have to be wearing. What happens if there were 2 residents on this tour that said, you are not coming into my apartment right now? Well, that's something, it's a new wrinkle that we have to kind of deal with in order to, in this current environment. But you got to get creative on that kind of stuff.
You know, it's been interesting. We've had people who call in to have something worked on in their unit, and then when the people get there to fix it, they won't let them in. You know, our world, we've never shut down because we operate about 1 million square feet of mixed-use projects in Louisville. So we've got buildings that are fully functional. You know, the folks are there working, and you know, we've got a staff here that takes care of all that. Our design staffs, our financing staff, they're all at home. And when we reopen fully, we'll give them the alternative of whether they want to come back or not. Because different people have different needs with regard to childcare, with regard to where they are in the exposure of this from their own physical standpoint. And I think that's not something that we as an employer can dictate. I think we've got to empower the employees to really decide how they want to come back from that standpoint.
You kind of touched on a great point right there. I'm going to throw a poll question out to see who's been touched by COVID. I got to tell you, this is week 8 of doing webinars. In the first 7 weeks, I didn't have one person on the panel who had it or had a relative have it. And now this week we've already had 2. So I think it'll be interesting to see in our industry as it moves through and people actually get sick, how that changes some of those dynamics. So let's talk about where opportunities are. So if I'm sitting back right now and I'm planning my next 6 to 9 months as a real estate professional, whether that's a broker or a developer or lender, where are the opportunities going to emerge? What are some things that I could hang my hat on and go after?
I think a lot of that has to do with what's going to happen with the banks. I think they're holding a lot of the cards here. I think you're seeing tenant defaults, whether it's multifamily or retail, and that's floating up to the landlord who has to deal with that. And the landlord, you know, in turn has to talk to their bank about it. We're seeing it really is just depending on the situation. I think it's too early to say what it's going to look like from banks having to deal with defaults and stuff like that. But I've talked to plenty of community bankers here who have said that they do feel there's going to be some situations whereby they're taking properties back and they already are prepared to do that. I think that the flip side is the opportunities are, and you asked about that, is we're starting to see the investors poke their heads out. I'm starting to get the phone calls from local people and out-of-state people that we've worked with before who are saying, hey, what's going on? Are there any opportunities out there? There were billions and billions of dollars waiting on the sideline, frankly, for this moment. And there's billions of dollars that have been raised over the past month even to invest into, you know, opportunistic deals. And I think that's really going to start happening more and more. And we're starting to get those calls where people are sniffing around saying, hey, let me know if any opportunities shake loose, because I think that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think there are things in the pipeline that, you know, when you look at it, you're starting to see even now some compression in the cost of renovating or building. And so far, the banks have been keeping the interest rate low. They haven't created so much of a spread that it's still not a good buying or developing opportunity. I think you just got to be real careful about what that niche is. And I think, you know, the apartment market thing in our city, we're starting to be in the urban areas to really, it's not what it was traditionally, which was a place to work. It's become more like the bigger cities where it's really a downtown neighborhood. We just need more. We just invested in a soccer stadium that will open sometime. And there's just more amenity here that makes it a nice place to live. And I think there's some opportunities to get some things built that a few months ago would have cost a lot more.
Does the urbanism clash with the social distancing? Do you feel like maybe in the short term, those amenities aren't being used, but in the long term, you feel good about it?
It's interesting. Steve said something about the elevators, and we had to deal with that in the building I'm sitting in right now, which, was sort of staging people in the elevator so they wouldn't all get off at the same time. And so we put some signage up, and, we contacted the tenants about, respecting other people's needs. And thank goodness we got past elevators. So it really had to happen. And most people are respectful. I do think one of our great amenities has been parks, and the parks are up 8%. So people are out, and they're out in areas where they feel they can be safe. And I think if we can safely reopen some things by having more sidewalk opportunity to go in and get a takeout bag and come and, be with people but not be close to them. I like the parks. A lot of picnics in the parks going on. I mean, it's a fascinating thing watching it. And I think those amenities are important. It's a lot different than what I expected it to be, but that has become one of it was always perceived as one of Louisville's strengths, but now it's really seen as a tremendous strength to our community, having those parks and open spaces and, broad streets that we can kind of narrow down and make them expansions of our restaurants, so that you might be at 30% inside the doors, but you can come out into the street.
I don't know how many people are watching out of state, but if you are and you haven't been to Louisville in the spring, it's the most beautiful state in our nation from, late March until it starts to get really hot. So I agree with you. I hadn't thought about that. The parks are now all of a sudden perhaps your best amenity. That's interesting.
One of the things we're not going to see, I'm quite confident, in the conventional multifamily space is blood in the water. And we didn't really see it in the multifamily space even in the bottom, the worst of the Great Recession. And we saw distress for sure, but not the volumes that the distressed capital was hoping to find. And I just don't. I think the people that are looking for opportunistic plays, distressed plays, post COVID is going to be largely disappointed in the conventional space because we just don't have the distress. And if the early collections indicators are any barometer of what the rest of this is going to look like as we come out of the crisis, it just emphasizes my point. You look at groups like Greystar. I spoke with today. Greystar is I think they're the largest operator of multifamily in the nation with 250,000 units. The Chicago division, so closest, most relevant to us here on this call, operates 20,000 units. They're about 93% total collected today for April in their portfolio. I mean, that's a number that nobody would have estimated 45 days ago. If we're thinking about what in the world is April collection is going to look like, whatever April is. May has to be worse. May is not worse. Not it's up and down. For some, it's a hair worse. Some, it's a hair better than April was. And clearly, we've got stimulus money that's helping facilitate May rent payments now, which we won't have arguably in June. So now maybe we flip to June and say, okay, June is going to be the real bellwether month. But I think that the train wreck concerns that a lot of groups, that maybe most operators had 30 days ago, 45 days ago, are just not materializing.
Yeah, and to Steve's point, also, I think we're seeing the banks are working with the borrowers. I mean, there's a community bank here, I know for a fact, that any borrower under a certain level, like a $3 million and under level or whatever it is, they're just giving 90 days of mortgage forbearance no matter what. And I think some banks can do that and some can't. And I think the Fed has given them some latitude to do that. And I think that helps. And I think that that's really giving a lot of relief as well, where these landlords that maybe are facing some issues or could be down the line are going to give it some relief and can in turn grant relief to their tenants if they don't have to make the mortgage payment. So if that's something that can happen, that's going to really help a lot.
One of the sectors where there's concern is certainly the student housing space, where we've got universities that, some universities have already made statements that they will not be opening in the fall. And then you've got universities like Purdue, where Mitch Daniels has a very clear plan for reopening and for social distancing and making sure that universities can do what they do, which is make money to educate people on campus. So it's there's some pockets in the apartment space, student housing being one, senior housing being another, where you've got a resident base that is most vulnerable to the COVID crisis, where there are some concerns, but by and large, the apartment space as a whole is surviving. And there are even stories of groups in Bloomington that are obviously Bloomington, Indiana University, that are fully exposed to student housing. They're 95% collected for the last 2 months. I mean, those are some pretty remarkable data points that are not necessarily unique stories.
I hadn't put much thought into student housing. I'm glad you brought that up. I did see the House Democrats at the federal level proposed a lot more money for the low income. So it sounds like B and C apartments are probably going to be supported all the way through the end of 2020, if not longer. So that'll be interesting to see if that gets passed and that doesn't change that market too. But Steve, you feel the same is true for the Class A markets as well?
I think to date, the Class A space has fared better than the BC space. I mean, the Class A are higher income renters that are more able to pay, that have been and less impacted negatively by the crisis, where the BC renters lacking subsidy have been most impacted. BC renters where there's subsidy, they're getting federal assistance or other assistance that has allowed them to pay. But yes, to date, the A's have performed better. It's not wildly better, but 2 to 3% better overall on collections is what we're seeing.
Well, we're running out of time. I got to say something to the audience real quick. I put this poll up here that says, if you or a loved one had COVID, and it's a yes, no answer. If you haven't answered, put your answer in there, because right now it's 100% no. There's got to be somebody. So I can't tell how many people have responded, but go in there and push that button if you get a chance. We probably have 1 minute each left. Give us your final thoughts on anything you like, anything we missed, anything you want to touch on. Start with Bill.
Well, I think it's interesting. We were talking about the strength of multifamily, and I do think it's going to continue to be strong. My thought is we've thought about how some of the hotel market, I think, will not survive this. And I think some of those buildings could be applicable for workforce housing as a conversion. So we're trying to look at the world that way a little bit. Where is the weakness? How can that maybe what can be turned easily into something else that may fill a market need?
And to Bill's point, Simon, the largest operator of retail in the nation, has developed a new program called asset intensification, whose sole purpose is to take dark Dick's sporting goods stores, dark Sears, dark JCPenney's, whatever it might be, dark big box space, and repurpose it. And multifamily is a very logical place to look for repurposing.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think my kind of last thoughts are, and this is my mindset is, and this is really for any real estate professional. I mean, the death and the health issue is terrible. The economic carnage is terrible. But this is a time of great disruption, and with great disruption comes great opportunity. And that's kind of, you can keep that mindset. If you're a tenant who's looking for space and is thinking about opening a business, well, what better time than now to be searching for space? If you're a buyer of a building for your business, or whether it's manufacturing, office, anything, you're not going to maybe find a better time in your lifetime with price drops potentially and interest rates to purchase something, and the same with an investor. So I think that we need to kind of put that kind of spin on it as well, and realize this could be an opportunity like we may never see in our lifetime from a real estate perspective if you are looking to invest or move forward on something.
That's an interesting point. Anything else, Steve, you want to add?
We've hit the highlights, which are that the multifamily space is well protected. We're going to see the green light sooner than other sectors, and it's not just a domestic capital wall. It's an offshore to global capital wall that's moving in on the U.S. And that's not a new story. It's an old story. But I think we see that intensify. We didn't talk about single family at all on this call, but I think that this crisis, like the last crisis 13 years ago, puts an exclamation point in a lot of folks' minds as to why they want to be in an apartment versus exposed to single family, which is setting them up for a ride with market turbulence. So we're all in the multifamily space, and so that's the Kool-Aid that we're all drinking. But I think there are a lot of reasons to be very optimistic about what the future looks like as we come out of this.
Interesting. Well, we're out of time. I want to make a plug quick again for our sponsors, because we've had to pivot as a business to webinars, and we couldn't pull it off if we didn't have sponsors and speakers and people that wanted to watch. So I'm really happy with how our business has been able to do this. So it's great, and it's all thanks to you all. We do have a lot more webinars in planning stages that I think you want to pay attention to. Watch your email, because we're going to get some top national economists and start talking about reopening, and some CEOs of some of the really large REITs and what they're thinking with their capital, including Blackstone and some other people with a lot of money and find out what they're looking at. So thank you, gentlemen, for your time. This was great. We'll have a replay available on YouTube, and we'll hope to talk to all of you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.